Here we go. And we are recording. And I'm lucky enough to have with me today Peter Dobromylskyj, who is a veterinary anaesthetist and nutrition blogger. Welcome.
Hi, nice to be here. Thanks very much, Ali.
Thanks for coming on. So in my view, you're something of a citizen scientist legend, having been cited here, there, and everywhere by some of the people I'd consider real pioneers in nutrition, including people like Dr. Mike Eades, whose book Protein Power is a New York Times bestseller. And your blog, which is called Hyperlipid, is unapologetically dense with science. But I think it started rather simply. I believe you wanted to help out a friend who had an issue. Is that right? And what happened there?
Well, it was a little bit before then, and I'd gone to an anesthesia meeting in Utrecht on cannabis of all things, and cannabis in the intensive care unit. And I met a friend there who had gone on to Atkins induction and dropped from 18 stone to 12 stone in 6 months.
Wow.
I'd had no interest in metabolism other than trying to manage my diabetic patients. And he said, you should get the book, you should read it. And on the way home from Utrecht, I bought a copy at the airport and had a read. And it kind of split into two parts. One was selling multivitamins, which I didn't really buy terribly much.
Mm-hmm.
And the other was heavily referenced and was basically about metabolism. Now, this is back in 2002, and there wasn't the stuff published in those days that we've got now. But I just discovered PubMed. All of my anesthesia tickets I got by going to the library, getting an up-to-date review, and following stuff back by going journal to journal on foot from shelf to shelf and photocopying stuff. And PubMed, to me, became accessible turn of the century, around about 2000. And this were in 2002. So I could go and check whether what Atkins said in his book held water. And kind of it was good in most parts. It was good enough to convince me to give it a go just out of interest. I wasn't overweight. I had no weight to lose at all. I had a little tummy. I was 40 odd at the time, but I didn't consider myself overweight. And I was extremely active on a sporting basis. I used to kayak surf off the beach. We lived just off the beach at the time. And if I had a couple of hours spare, that was where I would go if there were any waves. And once you started picking at the references, you discovered on PubMed that little line that said related links or related subjects. And I just click on that and go. And from there onwards, it just exploded outwards. I went on to Atkins induction. My wife was not very enthusiastic about it, but she had major gut problems and IBS type things. And we basically put her on to Atkins induction, and within 2 weeks she was off of the antacids, and the syndrome where regurgitated coffee that she drank at 11 in the morning would come down her nose at 11 at night disappeared completely as well. And that was off the omeprazole. And it was hard. It was not easy. You walk around Sainsbury's and they would be pumping out that fresh bread smell. I presume they buy it in cartons, pump it out through the air conditioning. That was the first 6 weeks was not easy, but we've both been low carb since then to varying degrees. I personally, well, we both went through a little bit of safe starches and found that was not helpful, and went back to basically near ketogenic eating. I'm the extremist. I don't really do carb creep. My wife is less extreme than me in most things, that's where we began from. But the changes were so dramatic. And the ability to exercise on a sustained basis was so worth having, that I've stuck with it, and I've not changed since. Obviously, I've been talking on the blog recently that things have modified a little bit, but none of it is a matter of going back and saying, well, I made a mistake, I'm going to kill myself by eating low carb, I'm going to short my life or whatever. As far as I can tell, the evidence base is fairly good, bearing in mind that I'm probably the most biased pro-low carb person you'll meet, excepting people who may have a financial stake in it. I mean, I have no financial stake in anything. Okay, that's how it began.
It's a great story, and there's a lot of interesting stuff to talk about in there. I want to talk about Atkins a bit because he's an interesting figure, and but I like talking about bias too. I think it's a really fascinating subject. I think once it's just, what I've noticed is that amongst low carb people, there's a real overrepresentation of professional scientists, engineers, that kind of thing. And
people. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And you know, I've got a physics and engineering background, and you know, when evidence was presented to me originally by my professor Ken Strain, who's appeared on the podcast, and he was trying to be as hands off as possible. He said, check these things out, see what you think. So various sources, including your blog. And I feel like once you read and understand these kinds of sources, it's actually very difficult to conclude otherwise, that low carb is safe and effective, because there really is a lot of good evidence for it. And in terms of bias, I think, yes, of course, acknowledging that once you've come to some conclusion about something, you have this confirmation bias. You know, you're in the sort of wider scheme of things, you're on team low carb, but in the personal side of things, you are team you, and you've decided low carb is a good thing, and so that means you're going to stick to that because you don't want to look like an idiot by having been wrong. And
well,
I think that's the main source of bias, you know. So whether someone's taking money or not, it feels to me like the main source of bias is your past decisions.
Yes. I completely agree with that. I completely agree. And on the engineering side as well, that's an interesting background. I come from anesthesia, and if you make the wrong decision when you're anesthetizing a couple of million quid's worth of racehorse, and it dies, it will die within, if you're really unlucky, 30 seconds of you making the wrong decision.
Wow.
You don't have the ability to sit back and say, well, we screw up on dietary advice and it's going to take 30 years to find out. You have a need to make sure you're right as well as you can, theoretically, before you actually do something. So, you know, if my supervisor, when I was doing my anesthesia diploma, would give me a stack of papers 4 inches thick and say, go read all those, and we're gassing horse tomorrow. Thanks, Polly. But it made you very, very analytical, and it made you learn how to read a paper. So you could look at a paper and go, well, okay, they did this, this, and this, but I wouldn't do that, that, and that. So what's going to be different about what's going to come out at the end of the year? And that's the way I ended up looking at nutrition papers. But obviously on a nutritional basis, you've got decades before a fudge factor before you turn out to be right or wrong. Okay, yeah, but yes, coming back to bias, that's once you've nailed your colours to the mast, that's it. You've nailed your colours to the mast. You're going to look really stupid. It's like the vegans that stop being vegan; they get crucified by the true believers. Hopefully, I don't. But it's there. It's there as a bias. You're quite right.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it happens in any group. You know, I think vegans seem to be particularly harsh to former members because it's a moral crusade as much as anything. Yeah. I think low carbing can be similar. I think low carbers, sort of vehement low carbers, tend to think that they're protecting human beings, and vegans tend to think they're protecting human beings and any sentient beings besides. So maybe a greater burden, maybe a greater, they feel like it's a greater cause somehow. But I have seen, people say if folk give up low carb, that maybe, they didn't do it right. I think you see the same things on either side.
Yeah, I have to say that my wife is an extremely great reminder to me that low carb is not a panacea for everything. It really isn't. I've come to low carb basically with very few medical problems, and they've been relatively low grade, and they've improved fairly significantly on low carb. But I'm not in the situation where I have to low carb. I could go and do other things and be basically healthy. But just occasionally there are things that the problems then with not going low carb come back to, as you say, in terms of what would you've nailed your colours to the mast, and suddenly you think, oh shit, I'm wrong. Anyway, by the by. But no, the so that's the biases are there. I also, the other thing about the vegans was the moral crusade. The first university society I joined when I got to the Royal Veterinary College was U4, the University's Federation for Animal Welfare. And I've always felt that you should be looking after, if you're going to eat an animal, it should have a good life, and B, it should have a good death. It's going to die. Whatever happens, we're all going to die. And if a cow has a pasture-fed life, or even, I mean, I worked as a vet for a while in mixed practice in rural Norfolk. We had barley beef. We had cattle in on indoor yards in the winter. They were out on acre marshes in the summer, and the units I worked at, which were relatively low tech units, I had no embarrassment about being the vet serving these cattle. And to me, what matters is probably the half an hour between leaving home and getting the bolt in the head. It's going to die if it can die cleanly with minimum upset, minimum stress. In fact, there was a while in the UK where we had mobile slaughterhouses where they would drive a truck around to the farm, stun the bullock and butcher it on the farm. And that to me was ideal. I'm not sure whether it's happening anymore. I think not. The rules and regs for meat inspection are so tight in the UK, rightly so. That I think that's all gone, and all of the small slaughterhouses have gone out of business. So it tends to be the bigger ones that survive. So that to me is not a positive thing on animal welfare, but that I think on a non-vegan animal welfare basis is the drive is that the cattle should live a cattle appropriate life, and they should die as atraumatically as possible. Then I'm willing to eat them quite happily, but they need a decent life, and the same applies. I think the biggest problem are again, my kids eat chicken quite a lot, and they like chicken on a welfare basis to a huge extent. It's a disaster area, and there are lots of things you can talk about chickens and chicken things like that. We keep our own chickens. We don't eat them because by the time they pass away, they're old and stringy. But I'm quite happy to keep chickens and eat the eggs from them without any moral issues. They're all mostly expats. We don't buy pedigree chickens. They've had a horrendous life. They get the last couple of years pecking around in the dirt. That's fine by me. And when they do go, if they're ill, a lot of them do sudden deaths, and chickens do that if they're old. But if they're going to have to be put to sleep, then it's a single injection, or I bury them. We don't eat them. But that's just because of the type of chickens I keep. But welfare-wise, I feel somewhat uncomfortable about the white meats, that's for sure. And I have a good friend in animal welfare who says that wild-caught fish the process of death is not pleasant. These factory farmed fish that you get. So that's the other slight issue I have is we do eat salmon still, wild caught salmon, but the kind of ethical background to it, I think, is slightly dubious. I'd always felt basically, well, we've all got to die. The salmon's got to die at some stage. The process between being caught and being dead, it's not that long, but the process isn't always good.
Oh, really? I've not heard that.
Yeah, that's from one of the people who the government put out a consultation request for animal welfare on slaughter, and she was heavily involved in that. So
that's interesting. I know that
I didn't go into the great details, but it's a matter of how long you spend before you're eviscerated. So she was very dubious about wild caught fish, well, about fish basically on a welfare basis. I've always been worried about chicken, and so that leaves you basically with the ruminants. And we get back to the ruminati, and ruminants have got a huge amount going for them. So there.
Yeah, I would agree. You know, the amount of land in the UK which is naturally appropriate for ruminants is quite large. It's about 65% of the land is good for grazing, and so we're kind of lucky here. You get a lot more pork in places where pork and chicken where there's less grazing land, and at that point when you're raising monogastrics, the welfare seems to go downhill a little bit. Because there isn't that opportunity to pasture them.
And well, the reason I like sheep and lamb particularly, because if you stick them in a barn, they die. They're not adapted to living indoors. They've got to be outdoors on a health and welfare, well, a health basis. So really, you can't do intensive sheep farming, or if you can, they don't do it around here. I think that they have huge trouble with being confined, particularly with respiratory disease. So they're out and about on the hill. And we do have sheep in East Anglia, but not like you have them up in Scotland.
Yeah, it's brilliant up here. And I spent a bit of time in New Zealand, and of course they've got something like 10 sheep to every person they've got. I think it's brilliant, and it's interesting. I'm sure somebody or some company would come along and do an intensive indoor sheep farm if they could, and welfare standards would be eroded, because where there's a buck to be made, then it will be. So it's really interesting. And I think if I had my way, I would probably stick to ruminants all the time, and maybe even do a bit of hunting for venison and game. Perfect place in Scotland. It's just a shame that many of the estates are owned by members of parliament and Qatari businessmen and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So
you can one shot kill if you can do it.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
As close to euthanasia as a food animal is going to get. So I'm all in favour of the absolute minimum suffering for them.
Yeah, I agree completely, and I think doing that kind of calculus is hard, because bringing in the suffering of people who might not have the advantage of eating healthy food, if you're not raising these animals for their food, can be brought into the equation, and at that point it becomes kind of murky and hard to add up. But I guess it's easy to see when an animal is suffering in a prolonged way, and I don't know if you've seen the TED talk or the film about Temple Grandin.
No, I've not seen that one yet.
Where I think she's on the autistic spectrum, and she's got a way of seeing things, and so she kind of is able to empathize with the way animals see things, and she's designed and patented slaughterhouse layouts that keep the animals calm.
To read her book. I know she has a book That's on my to read list. But yeah, absolutely. Yeah. If you can minimise the stress to the animal, that's where it comes from. Yeah. No, I do know who you mean now, much more so. Yeah, that would be nice. And she in the States, isn't she?
That's right.
Slaughterhouse in the States. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, there is that TED talk. I'll go for that one.
And yeah, you started talking about Atkins as well, and he was an interesting character. I spoke to Professor Tim Noakes a little bit about Atkins. Often he gets slagged off online for being larger when he died. And people rushed to his defense, saying that he put on a lot of weight due to a condition partly caused by his hitting his head when he fell over. But of course, they did find some, or did they, some atherosclerosis, and his arteries furred up. You know, it's not clear exactly what his health condition was, but what Tim Noakes pointed out was that Atkins probably didn't stick to his own diet very well.
Well, his own diet recommended a progressive increase in carbohydrate. There was Atkins induction, which I think, was it 2 weeks? Maybe it was 4 weeks. I think it was 2 weeks. And then you increased carbohydrate up to a level which you are comfortable with your weight at. And that's self-determined. There's no formula to it at all. And there were a number of, to me, that caused a number of problems to particularly the technical studies on a low carbohydrate diet basis, because they were always started off comparing Atkins induction ad libitum food intake with calorie restricted low fat diets. This was the standard way of doing it. And in the vast majority of the studies, obviously the Atkins induction would win hands down. But there was then always put in the protocol would include a progressive increase in carbohydrate intake to the level that you're comfortable with. And again, this is not rigorously controlled. And at that point, you start to lose the benefits of the low. You only ever get any benefit from low carbohydrate dieting if you don't eat the carbohydrate. As you start to increase it, then you get more and more like a mixed diet or a Mediterranean type diet. And the appetite suppression that comes with the initial ketosis, particularly if you're overweight, well, that's gone. And you're then not comparing genuinely low carb diet with, in ad lib terms, with a calorie restricted low fat diet. You're getting more and more to just low calorie diets rather than the Atkins induction. So there was a lot of controversy about the weight of Atkins when he died. But again, as an anaesthetist, you have some idea of how you run an intensive care unit. And the comments that he gained a lot of weight through fluid therapy are absolutely correct. I mean, at the time that they were running critical care work in the turn of the century, you had a set of numbers that you use to keep a patient alive. They've got to have this level of arterial blood pressure, this level of peripheral vascular resistance, this level of oxygenation, and you would manipulate whatever you needed to manipulate to keep the numbers within physiological limits. Often the patient heavily sedated, ventilated, and your number has got to be kept correct. If that means volume loading, fluid loading, to the point where you develop massive peripheral edema and fluid retention, then that's what you do. And all of that, if your patient survives, all of that's going to go away. It will just, you back off on the fluid therapy and it's all urinated out. So the actual number of the weight, I can quite easily believe was very, very markedly increased by the manipulations you have to do to maintain blood perfusion to the brain, which is what you're trying to maintain with a head injury. So I've got no problem with that. How well he stuck to his diet, I don't know. He was also reputed in his own book, or he was also reputed to have a myocarditis. And again, you then start asking, well, what's a myocarditis and why is it there? And you're still 15, 20 years away, or nearly, from the people taking the Paleolithic approach, where if you had an inflammatory problem like that, you would be getting out all of the grains and anything that's affecting intestinal permeability in an attempt to try and control the underlying inflammatory process, whether it would be autoimmune or whether it would be non-specific inflammatory. I wouldn't like to say, but that there were a lot of things that Atkins would not have been in any way paleo. And from what I was reading in his book, there was no specific exclusion of grains. You could have crackers and things like that if they were low carb, high fat. That's fair enough. But that's what he was doing at the time. But there are a lot of things that have changed since then that might be done differently, which may or may not make a difference in the outcome. But he did have other medical problems. He was also a complete pain in the arse, to be quite honest. If you read Yudkin, you've read John Yudkin, yeah?
Yeah.
Yudkin put a comment in one of it's probably in Pure, White and Deadly, actually. One of his comments was that Atkins put back the cause of low carb nutrition by decades because he was such an ornery, aggressive, unpleasant person. I mean, I don't know. Atkins died just as I started low carbing. So and again, there weren't podcasts. There was nothing like there is today. So you couldn't actually verify anything like that at all. But Yudkin was really down on Atkins in terms of his approach and abrasiveness. I don't think the two particularly saw eye to eye. And Yudkin was, as far as you could tell from his writing, a genuinely nice bloke, and not particularly anti-food industry. He worked with them, he took money from them, but he appeared to maintain a fairly reasonable ethical stance, and he was perfectly willing to work with the food industry if he thought he could take it towards the low carb approach that appeared to benefit his patients.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I hadn't heard that about Atkins before. I had heard it about Otto Warburg, who did so much work on the the so-called Warburg effect, about how cancer cells metabolize. That's actually the podcast that's just gone out, and Thomas Seyfried talking about that. But that Otto Warburg was so unpleasant that he almost, even though he was one of the most brilliant scientists of his generation, and everybody acknowledged that, nobody wanted to advance his cause or work with him because he was awful.
Yeah, it happens, I'm sure.
You talk about Atkins to start, but there's a lot of stuff in your blog from the earlier days about the so-called optimum diet, which maybe you could talk about that and how you got into that.
Yeah, well, I did about 6 months on Atkins induction, got over the weakness and the muscle aches, and I kind of started looking at it just pure logic. And Jan Kwasniewski, who died earlier on this year, had this optimal diet, and he basically said, run on animal fat, eat enough protein to replace the protein that you're losing on a daily basis, and eat enough carbohydrate to replace the carbohydrate that you're using up on a daily basis. And it was pure logic. Have you ever read any of his books?
Never have.
No. He was a complete wild card. He had the most bizarre ideas that whenever you got the chance to check one of them, he was usually right, which I found quite scary. But there was not a lot of research to back up his ideas. They did a little bit in the group that he ran as the years went by, but to be that extreme and to be that anti-vegetable, he was completely anti-polyunsaturated and very pro-saturated fat. What he was saying fitted in with the papers and things I was reading that were the follow-on from Atkins, and then just broadening out. And it just seemed logical. This was something that I took to a large extent on faith, which you shouldn't do, but I couldn't see anything against it. It appealed because he was such an off-the-wall maverick. Again, you shouldn't really make your decisions based on that sort of basis. I did it for a while. It worked perfectly well, and I stuck with it for a long, long time. And obviously, as the years go by, I'm curious about what works, what doesn't work, and I will tweak this or tweak that. He was also very much a nose to tail person. So offal was on the agenda twice a week. And as you go by year after year, I get lazy, and I'll be running an optimal like diet. And I think we all do a certain amount of drift. My drift wasn't to increase carbohydrate intake. My drift, if anything, was to drop carbohydrate intake, which was not something he was keen on. My drift was upward protein. Again, getting sources of fat that don't have protein attached to them is actually quite hard. So even if you're eating high fat sources, never ignoring meat and things, but snacky type things like macadamia nuts, they all come with a protein load. Even very high percentage cocoa chocolate comes with a very low grade protein load, but there is a protein load there. And I think over the years, I probably did protein creep more than I did carb creep. And it's interesting that from the metabolic point of view, he was very pro-saturated fat, but not pro-ketones. And yeah, quite. And you can see that there's a certain amount of logic to that, because if you have a tissue that can burn fat, then it's going to get the most energy out of a saturated fat, because you haven't got the double bonds that are not producing the FADH. But we'll come back to that hypothesis. My ideas on that later, if you like. But he was very much that metabolism should run on fat rather than ketones, and I could never really get anything convincing as to why it should be on that basis, apart from where you put your input into the electron transport chain. So that when I finally decided I was going to make a change, I didn't worry too much about the fact that I was going to go properly into ketosis. But with the level of activity I've had over the years, I've always been on the edge of ketosis anyway. You ever did a dipstick? I've not bothered with ketone meters because it's not something I'm particularly interested in. But if you ever peed on a dipstick, there will be some ketones there. And if I did a long bike ride, 4 or 5 hours, then yeah, you'd be off at the 4+ stage. I've no huge faith in the keto sticks in terms of accuracy, but they'll tell you which ballpark you're in, and that was all the level of interest that I had, because I'm not trying to manage a neurological problem or anything like that. So to me, it's just curiosity more than anything else. But no, Janko said he had some interesting ideas. He had very interesting ideas about temperament and nutrition as well, which fits in perfectly well with how we look at the vegans and how they're not always the happiest of people. We have a number of friends that are vegans, and certainly many that are vegetarian, and they're perfectly nice people. And not always the healthiest, but there are certain character traits that you do wonder whether the question was right about how food, long-term nutrition affected behavior, and that there are little bits come through on that are quite believable nowadays. With all the things about the observational epidemiology about depression in vegetarians kind of rings true.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously you could come at it with any epidemiology and say, well, maybe they're depressed because they're thinking about the plight of the animals so much, or maybe there's some other thing going on there.
Yeah, or maybe the sort of person that's depressed is the sort of person that gravitates to vegetarianism. You can't tell, it's just epidemiology. But he had ideas along those lines, and I found them interesting, and I found them potentially plausible. But you can never get any hard data to really back them up.
Yeah, I mean, I love all that stuff too. When I first started dabbling with this, I noticed huge changes in my mental bearing, and it was, anything from anxiety to depression to a diagnosed ADHD that more or less vanished very quickly, if not overnight, when I started, I suppose, running my brain on ketones. rather than cheap carbs. And the mood thing was huge. And I started thinking, how much of any individual's mood swing is food, or caffeine, or any of the other things that we take in, nicotine, rather than a true response to what's going on around them. They talk about zero carb zen, and I definitely feel that.
And I mean, obviously, you've had Tucker on recently, and he's from slightly different slant. He's on but an equally anti-omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acid basis. And I have to say that I kind of look back and think, well, the cardiologists really, really screwed everybody over in the 1970s. And now we have the millennials coming through who have been conceived and reared on polyunsaturated fatty acids. And how much of the depression problems that that are so prevalent everywhere, the inability to cope with the stress that comes through, the ability to be, is the word triggered?
Yeah.
How much of this mental instability might be diet related? And
yeah, absolutely.
Because that crosses my mind on a repetitive basis.
Yeah, there's a couple of studies that Emily Deans, the psychiatrist who's on Twitter, who did an article for Psychology Today a few years ago now, and talks about the Young Offenders Institute in the Netherlands that prescribed, did a double-blind, placebo-controlled test on high omega-3 fish oil. Yes, and they found that the amount of violence committed by those who were on the omega-3 versus placebo dropped away precipitously. So there's definitely something in it. And I wondered that too, with the tissue levels of linoleic acid having gone up markedly over the last 50 years or so. Exactly what effect is that having? There seems to be some very deep correlations with some disturbing behavior, like homicide, for example.
Well, that was in the original, was it the Mr. Fit study?
Was it? Yeah.
I forget which, it might have been that one, but basically there was a minor decrease in cardiac deaths, but it was replaced by suicide and violence. But it was one of those very, very early lipid lowering studies that, and it was violence and depression. People would throw a fist at someone in a bar in downtown Texas. Well, that's not a good thing to do.
Yeah.
No, I think behavior, I think we got here from Krasniewski, didn't we? He was talking about character types and behavior. And I can see that you can look at the biochemistry and the brain biochemistry and see that these are quite plausible things that might have some groundings in reality.
Yeah, and another interesting thing that comes up when people talk about the optimal diet is the guy who wrote it was Polish, right?
Yeah.
And some people criticize it for there's some whispers and maybe not good enough evidence, but that there's potentially more gastric cancers in Poland, or in particular people who follow that kind of high animal fat diet in Poland.
There certainly is, because I looked at the epidemiology of that. There is an increased risk of certainly gastrointestinal cancers in Poland, full stop.
Yeah.
When the optimal diet people they've got one published paper where they documented a lot of the metabolic parameters. And some of the people on the optimal diet, I think they were, again, this is from memory from a long time ago, but they were running quite high insulin levels. And I think if you have a very, very high saturated fat diet and enough carbohydrate to stimulate insulin secretion, the insulin won't be mopped up by the liver. There will be very little first pass insulin metabolism in the liver. So the insulin ends up in the systemic circulation. And just again, if you go back to metabolic syndrome as a driver of cancer formation, then insulin is going to be one of your key signaling molecules to determine whether a cell divides or not, whether it should grow. And the correlation between insulin elevated usually through insulin resistance and cancer formation seems quite convincing to me. So whatever diet you're running on, I think your best surrogate for low insulin is going to be weight loss. I mean, people aren't going to measure their insulin levels on a 4 times a day basis. And one of the things that when I went carnivore 6 months ago, one of the things that convinced me I might have done the right thing was I spontaneously lost a few kilos. I wasn't carrying that many kilos, but they just went. And I'm now probably a little bit too skinny, but there you go. Can live with that. But I look at body weight as a surrogate for 24-hour averaged insulin levels. That to me seems quite convincing.
Yeah, that seems fair. There's some really interesting stuff coming out. I don't know if you follow Jim Johnson, the professor in Toronto, I think.
I keep an eye on his papers, and they get tweeted by Rafi and George Harrison, with George Henderson on a regular basis. So I don't follow him on Twitter. I hardly follow anybody on Twitter. But no, his work is very interesting. I spent a lot of time this last 6 months going through his rodent insulin gene knockout papers. And again, they're quite interesting on a long-term basis, not only really longevity, but in terms of insulin-induced insulin resistance. There are a lot of, because basically he's backing off insulin exposure, and they stay insulin sensitive. But again, you have to get in very careful with semantics and whether insulin sensitivity is good, bad, or indifferent. So that's ultimately he's looking at a very interesting set of models, and I have a huge amount of time for him. I think he's doing very, very good work. But I always insulin sensitivity is a very slippery term.
Yeah, for sure.
And how good or how bad it actually is. Insulin sensitivity is fine if you don't use it. Because if you use it, you're going to get fat. Yeah, but yeah, you're into semantics there. But Jim Johnson's work, I have enjoyed over this last 6 months. I heard little bits from him before that, but I'd never actually gone back and gone through his papers in any great detail. But some of the ones with the insulin gene knockouts have turned out to be very, very interesting indeed, and very confirmation biasy as well.
Sure. I mean, he's been talking recently. He's been writing recently about the insulin environment and pancreatic cancer in mice. I was talking to a researcher the other day who's in Glasgow about pancreatic cancer. He's a professor looking at that, and one of the things that's so hard about pancreatic cancer seems to be that the immune system almost works on behalf of the cancer, allowing keeping the immune system away from attacking the cancer. So that I don't know if it's unique to pancreatic cancers, but certainly it does this. And that's one of the reasons why pancreatic cancer is so often fatal, is that the body kind of turns against itself. But he was interested to hear about the insulin thing. I think there's not a lot of joined up thinking in certain branches of science, just because everyone has their own niche and nobody's got the time to read everything.
Yes, yeah, this is true. And I find that if I get interested in a given subject, I will follow it and follow it and follow it. But there are an infinite supply of subjects, and you can't follow all of them. And I follow a given thought thread. And when you get things, because that we've all known for decades that insulin and type 2 diabetes and cancer are associated. And one of the few drugs that seems to make a difference on an epidemiological basis is metformin. And as far as I'm concerned, metformin simply blunts insulin signaling. That's its core function. Which would go a long way to why diabetics who continue to have hypoglycemia under the current management are significantly protected against cancer and cancer growth by metformin. So that puts insulin more at the center than hypoglycemia. And to see the paper come out from Jim Johnson's group with the pancreatic cancer and insulin, that's you can see how he's gotten there, because he's been looking at insulin and longevity and insulin and diseases of old age for quite a long time now. So yeah, that was a nice paper, that's for sure.
When I first came to the Hyperlipid blog, it was when you were heavily into high-fat dairy as a main fuel source. You know, it's a very clean way, in a sense, of getting lots of fat without the protein load. And I was just starting low-carb way of eating and dabbled with paleo. You know, so many of my issues and my extra weight just melted away on low carb. And it wasn't until further down the line that I thought I'd try to eliminate dairy to see what happened. Because I kept, you know, finding new layers of good health, eliminating one thing or another. And, you know, and I noticed several improvements, including my skin looking better. And kind of amazingly, I thought almost the last thing that I had wrong with me, which was that I'd lost part of my sense of smell a few years before. And it wasn't a very clean experiment. I stopped eating dairy very strictly and nightshade vegetables very strictly for a number of weeks, and my sense of smell came back. And, you know, how has your eating changed in the last few years of it, since you were, you know, doing a lot of fermented dairy and that sort of thing?
I had slight suspicions about dairy long time ago, on the basis that this came down to the signal for ending lactation. So when a cow or a human is lactating and there's a sudden cessation of the calf's taken away or baby's weaned or whatever, there is a signal for stopping the production of milk. And that signal is triggered by casein. And the casein opens the tight junctions between the epithelial cells which line the mammary gland and allow milk proteins to be seen by the immune system, which then causes an inflammatory reaction which shuts down the milk production. So that's how casein controls lactation.
So when the milk backs up, essentially it leaks back into the body and tells the body to stop making it.
But so intrinsic to how casein controls lactation is its ability to open tight junctions.
Okay, these are these gaps between cells that allow passage from one part of the body to another.
Yeah, classically from the intestine into the submucosa, into the lining of the intestine, basically.
Yeah, and then onto the bloodstream, I guess.
Yeah, and I came at this obviously from gluten, because we'd had gluten elimination very early on. Seemed to produce it was intrinsic to the changes in the diet that we made as part of health improvement. And I could see basically that yes, gluten opens the tight junctions. Casein does the same. And I wondered how much of a problem that might be. And the answer is I don't know. But the presumption is that if your casein is being broken down rapidly, because obviously it's a normal substance for babies to consume and for calves to consume. And you could say we're in the wrong species if we're consuming dairy, but that doesn't alter the fact that the calf doesn't get inflammatory bowel disease from drinking cow milk. So if the casein's broken down quickly enough, I think if it never gets from the stomach into the intestine, I don't see why it should cause a problem. It then becomes more of a question of random chance, whether you think you're breaking down casein quick enough not to cause inflammatory changes in your gut. So I was slightly dubious about casein from that basis, and you could then make arguments whether, again, unsubstantiated, but you could argue whether A1 casein is more persistent than A2 casein. So the Guernsey milk is fine, but the Frisian milk is not fine, or goat's milk is fine because the casein is different from Frisian casein. And that kind of pushed me very slightly towards going paleo in terms of taking dairy out. This is back in probably 2005, 2006, long time ago. And it was impossible. I was buying lamb chops and giving the meat to the cats, and eating a little bit of the meat and the fat, and it was just so restrictive in terms of how do you eat real food, but you're trying to get it just from meat. I found it very, very difficult, and I gave up, and because I couldn't get enough fat, basically. And this was something I revisited again back in May when I went carnivore, and just to look at practicalities, because I tried it a long, long time ago, and it'd been completely impracticable. And I just found a few dodges, and it worked fine. Also, I decided to give up on worrying about protein creep at that point. I was only going to do it for 3 weeks. So I gave up worrying about protein creep. Once you give up protein creep and you go to an easier ratio, you can eat 2 parts of fat to 1 part of protein. That means my protein ends up between 100 and 150 grams per day. It's much, much easier if you're going to accept the protein load. You're trying to eat a paleo optimal diet where you're not got dairy coming in. It's phenomenally difficult to get the fat content in. And that's why I tried it. I'd given up with it, and I thought, well, when I came to try carnivore on a pure, is this a practical thing to do for anybody? It was letting the protein creep upwards was what made it easiest. And then I could get the fat. All you then have to do is buy a block of lard and beef dripping, and that have your fat with your meat, and drink it if you have to. And that turned out to be much, much easier. But trying to do it originally with keeping protein low, it was practically impossible. I did it for about a week, and it was just, I can't do this long term.
Sure.
So, but I say, once you give up on keeping protein low, it's very, very straightforward to do, and not particularly socially acceptable, but it's very straightforward to do.
Yeah, I can see that, with people attempting different ratios of fat to protein in their diet, they get different results depending on who they are as well. Ambrose Hearn talks about needing a lot more fat in order to feel good physically and mentally, and emphasizes, I think, things like suet and bone marrow and that sort of thing, and adding dripping and that sort of thing. Maybe a lot of pork fat too. And I suppose if you're trying to keep the protein really low, then
it's very hard.
It's very hard, and it kind of makes you wonder whether it is evolutionarily appropriate, because if you can't find a fatty animal that's fatty enough without, discarding lots of meat, then you have to ask, is that what early humans did? It's a very difficult, it's an impossible question to answer, really. But it does make you wonder if this idea that you can game the system by keeping protein ultra low has a proper basis in reality.
Yeah, and ultimately, I think at the moment that question is fairly impossible to answer. I don't think we have the information to take a stab at that. I listened to Ron Rosedale's presentation that did the rounds recently, and I have a number of issues with it. He was one of the very, very influential people on my early days. He was, again, right back in the early 2000s, was talking very similar subjects to the ones he's talking at the moment, and I have a huge amount of time for him. But at the moment, I don't think there's enough to convince me, that's for sure, that extreme restriction is. I kind of just accepted it, and you thought, okay, high protein intake is going to raise growth hormone. Growth hormone is going to raise IGF-1. IGF-1 seems to be associated with cancer growth on all sorts of fronts. So that was the kind of, and I'd never really gone and checked it. It was the narrative, and I'm not expecting to live forever. Just want to try and just be healthy while I'm around. I did start going and checking it, and again, these are questions which should have been neatly answered a very long time ago, And they may have been, but because most scientific research over more than 5 or 10 years old tends to get ignored, there's not much going on about it at the moment. But you found that if you went back and looked at the very early papers on controlling type 1 diabetes, these children came out stunted because the level of insulin and the protocols of insulin that they were using on them never made them euinsulinemic. They would have multiple hyperglycemia periods with very low insulin levels until they're basically given enough insulin to keep them out of ketoacidosis. That was the initial goal back in the very early days. And they came up stunted, and they worked out eventually that growth hormone requires insulin to generate ILGF-1. And that to me was a sort of find. So theoretically, you can have growth hormone through the roof. If you fast somebody, growth hormone goes through the roof. ILGF-1 goes through the floor because there's no insulin, minimal insulin being secreted. So the conversion or the induction of production of ILGF-1 goes down despite growth hormone levels being high. And at that point, I started to think, well, maybe I don't have to worry about protein intake and even growth hormone levels. In fact, if you want to keep your muscle mass, then keeping growth hormone up is probably going to be a good thing. And as you get older, you're going to want to keep your muscle mass. And I'd like to keep my muscle mass. I'm getting old now. But keeping ILGF-1 low at the same time, well, you're then talking about fasting. And you can go to Amber O'Hearn and her concepts of fasting mimics ketogenic dieting. Putting things the wrong way around, which I rather like that, because I'd always thought of it as ketogenic diet mimicking fasting. But flipping it around is a good way to do it. So I've not measured anything at this stage. I keep eyeing, maybe I ought to just get an ILGF-1 insulin measured, and just out of curiosity. I'll get around to it one day, but I so far haven't.
Yeah, and you know the stuff about the way, I suppose, to summarize what Rosedale talks about, it's really that like you were saying, if you have a higher protein load, then you have these growth factors. And I've heard other longevity researchers like David Sinclair talking about this, and mTOR is a pathway that is activated as well with a lot of protein. And the idea being that you potentially promote the growth of cancer. And that, okay, if you think about a potential story for this, when we were hunter-gatherers in the dim and distant past and eating mammoth, and say there was lots of protein in there, and we would grow big and strong and muscular, but then die young, and it didn't matter because we had done enough to pass on our genes to the next generation and hunt successfully for the time that we were there. But that's just one of those just so stories that there's not necessarily any evidence to back up. And like you're saying, the older you get, the more bone and muscle density actually want up to a point, because the best indicator of whether you're going to have enough muscular strength to get yourself to hold yourself up tomorrow is how much you've got today. So it seems slightly logically backward to minimize the protein, or at least to the point where you're taking only as much protein as you need and no more.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if you're a mouse in a cage, having muscle mass and muscle density doesn't matter.
Yes.
If you fall over, you've not got very far to go before you hit the ground of the cage. So that was always in the back of my mind, was that getting frail is probably not a very good thing to do. Getting frail if you're a mouse really doesn't matter. So these mice with growth hormone receptor knockouts that Prof. Lauren won the sort of prize with, because it's got the longest lived mouse in the world. They're growth hormone receptor knockout mice. So they got tons of growth hormone. It doesn't have a receptor to work on. They don't have any ILGF-1. They're stunted. They're fat. They're massively insulin sensitive, because that's why they're fat. And they live many hundreds of days longer than they should do, and nobody's come anywhere near getting a mouse to live that long using any other technique that I can come across. But those mice are, it doesn't matter how frail those mice are.
Yeah.
They're sitting in a cage, they're not going to do anything else. Whereas if I fall off the top of the climbing wall, I'm expecting not to break my leg when I hit the ground.
Sure.
On a day. So I can see pros and cons. But of course, even something as simple as Atkins induction, that'll drop ILGF-1 levels by about 20%. The paper that I found didn't have growth hormone levels, so but even using a protein-heavy Atkins induction compared to the standard American diet, you're going to drop ILGF-1 anyway. Whether you would drop it as much as going to a protein-restricted, seriously ketogenic diet, again, I don't think anyone's looked at that unless it's in rodents. But of course, you look at ketogenic diets in rodents, and they are so extreme just to get them into ketosis. I'm a huge fan of rodent studies, but I have trouble translating or trying to pick out what of the changes in a rodent ketogenic diet are from the ketosis or from the protein restriction, because you've got to have them down under 10% protein as an intake. And some of the ketogenic diets for rodents are methionine restricted anyway, just so that you smash the liver up. They have liver damage, and they can't export their fatty acids as triglycerides, so they export them as ketones. I think F3666 is the standard ketogenic diet for rodents, and it's specifically methionine restricted to enhance the ketogenesis. The longevity studies using that type of diet have always had normal methionine added back to them. So, and they won't have been as ketogenic as the methionine restricted one, but they still deliver the goods on a rodent basis with ketosis. And again, it's a longevity increase of about 20%. 15%, like that. Pretty much the same as you get with rapamycin. And you get with metformin, and you get with glucosamine. They're the four convincing longevity tweaks for rodents. And there are indications that glucosamine might actually work in humans. That's an awful lot easier than doing a ketogenic diet for the rest of your life, and it's an awful lot less toxic than taking rapamycin. But I think there is a post half written somewhere about that.
Yeah, there's some remarkable results with these combined therapies in mice, where any one of them alone gives them marginal improvements in life expectancy, but then put them together and you get this whopping increase. Yes, there's a lot of interesting speculation about. I went to see a talk recently by, I can't remember her name now, but she spoke about exactly this and made the mistake, in my opinion, to point out blue zones in humans and saying that it's low animal, it's plant-based that's really leading the way in terms of what we've got evidence-wise. I asked her a question about it afterwards, and because I don't think blue zones really stack up very well. But yeah, I mean, so would you describe what you're eating now as a kind of Paleolithic ketogenic diet where you don't really do dairy now, and you're not particularly restricting protein, but you're trying to keep the fat high still, and
that's pretty much what I do basically. Again, I'm a very pragmatic person. I don't really want to spend any more of my disposable income on food than I have to, and I simply found that if you can buy a block of, in the UK, you can buy a block of beef mince for £1.60 for 500 grams, and two of those, one and a half of those with a block of beef dripping. That's me fed for the day. And I'm still at the level where I'm buying lamb's hearts twice a week, or liver twice a week, or kidney twice a week. all of which are relatively low in fat, and you have to add enormous amount of fat to keep those at anything like ketogenic levels. But I've managed techniques for getting more fat without having to physically eat the fat that they're cooked in. You can get around it. There are ways and means. So it's an extremely cheap way of eating as well. This is not expensive. It's extremely socially restrictive.
Yes.
It really is. We go out for a meal, and I have steak. Splash out on the steak, that's fine. But that's only a steak. I have to come home and get a whole load of fat to go with that. Under dire circumstances, I will eat butter. If I'm at a restaurant and there's nothing I can add to my steak. And it drives my wife up the wall that I won't eat the salad that gets served with it. It's keto. It's definitely keto, but no, don't want to go there. No.
Yeah, that's fair enough. And what positive changes have you noticed after adopting that kind of diet?
There was the backache and the snoring were the two. But there's a whole long string of low-grade changes but I stopped snoring. That was number one.
Fascinating.
Yeah, I had Amber O'Hearn says her husband did the same thing when he went carnivore. And I do wonder whether there is some sort of trigger, possibly from the casein or secondarily from the casein acting on the gut. But I think anything that I do that decreases the congestion of my sinuses makes it much less likely they'll snore. I've got a horribly broken nose. It's been broken a minimum of twice as a youngster. It was never fixed or set or anything like that. And it's basically obstructed from the upper nasal septum on this one. And it then does a 90-degree bend, and the cartilaginous part of the nasal septum blocks the other nostril.
Wow.
And that's, I went to the GP about it once. He said, well, I can refer you to a surgeon, but just break your nose again. Yeah, I suppose you will. I'll give that a miss as an anaesthetist.
It sounds like you've almost got a kind of like a sort of clarinet or something. You've got a sort of set of pipes there.
It does, yeah. And if I roll on my back, even now, if I roll on my back, it will still make noise, and I get rolled back off of my back. But even with the most active efforts to stay off my back before, it was a recurrent marital problem. Okay.
And now it's stopped.
Well, it stopped. I had a relapse with it. I had a relapse with the back pain as well, and I was doing so well. I thought I would try coffee, because I love coffee and I haven't drunk coffee for 4 or 5 years, something like that. And I had a relapse when we were in Serrano, in a place in Italy, just around the corner from the Amalfi Coast. We were there at a cat conference, and the double espressos were just, they were so good. And I did that, and we came home, and I carried on having the occasional double espresso, and I have arthritis in my fingers, and God, it flared.
Wow.
It was just horrible. I was noticing it while I was operating, which I never noticed before, but just using artery forceps and things were painful. So I took the coffee out, went more seriously keto, and it settled down, and it went more or less completely when I went carnivore.
Wow.
And because I'd changed, my presumption was I had changed a lot of the content of my gut. So if it was a gut content that was triggering it off, and the caffeine was just opening up the tight junctions, because I've had an anecdote somewhere that caffeine, or coffee, not caffeine, that coffee can open tight junctions the way gluten and casein can, but I can't find no evidence base for that on PubMed at all. But there's a rumor that goes on. And but I thought I've changed my food. I've almost certainly changed my gut bacterial population. Maybe I'll get away with coffee, and I can have maybe a coffee a week. So I went back to the double espressos in the UK, not Italian, and low back flared horribly, snoring came back horribly, and I was,
my word.
Yeah, I was, and it didn't happen straight away. So I may be putting 2 and 2 together and making 35. But I'd had one coffee a week for 3 or 4 weeks, which was fine. And then we had half term and took the kids to lots of cafes, because when you're trying to bribe children to go shopping, you have to take them to the cafe. And I got through quite a lot of double espressos in the first 3 or 4 days, and I was the back pain came back with a vengeance, and the snoring came back slightly. So I took the coffees out again 2 weeks ago, and the back pain has settled down now. But it took that long. It was back on the ibuprofen. So the coffee was my one weakness, and that really screwed everything up. And you don't know how much I like coffee. So it's gone again.
I can get a notion. I can definitely sympathize and feel your pain, because I've spoken before in the podcast about how I used to smoke a lot of cigarettes. I used to smoke 40 a day when I was in China, and I used to drink a lot of coffee too. You know, working in restaurants after I left school, easy access. I used to have cups of espresso and seemed to respond, you know, in a kind of, at first, in a very, you know, I get these huge dopamine rushes and I feel absolutely amazing. I'm on a high.
It's a nice feeling.
Yes. And then eventually you're maintaining. So you just have to drink it to feel normal, which is the same with any kind of stimulant. But it's seductive. And I think it takes a long time to quieten those brain circuits down to the point where the cravings kind of subside and it's just something that you used to do. But man, when you get back on the train, it's hard to get off again.
Yes. Well, I'm lucky I had no choice. My back hurt like hell. So
yeah.
I'm also lucky that I have absolutely no problem with opioids. As I really can't.
Yeah.
I throw up like hell with opioids. So I've never ever had any temptation to go that route on a recreational basis. It's just nauseating. When I've had to take opioids for for serious low back problems, I was given a large supply of codeine, and they said take as much as you like till the pain goes away, and you just spend the day throwing up. So, but the kind of, this feels nice from coffee. I mean, I've never taken any more potent stimulants than caffeine, but when you're completely withdrawn from it, when you're completely clear of it, one double espresso has a very noticeable mental effect, either that or a placebo effect. It doesn't matter, you still get the mental effect. But no, I can't do that. And I'm a bit pissed off about that. Can't help that.
Yeah, me too. I wish I could. I wish I could handle it. I wish that feeling was, that you weren't just chasing the initial one. But such is life, I suppose.
The finger arthritis was interesting because my father had finger arthritis. And back as a kid, I was heavily into whitewater and flatwater racing and whitewater kayaking. And I'd get home and my fingers would still be frozen by the time I got home. My dad was going, "You'll regret that. You'll get arthritis in your fingers." And I'm thinking, no, that kind of implies you've got arthritis in your fingers. And there you go. I turned 60 and it just starts. And that's gone now. And because I don't kayak very much anymore, but I climb now, finger strength and finger joints are incredibly important. Once you get off the starting point climbs onto the ones where you're hanging on by your fingernail, I'm not quite at that level, but I'm now climbing stuff where finger strength has become much more important. And that is the other drive to keep A, off of the coffee, and B, off of the whatever else it was. I stopped when I went carnivore because the fingers have improved no end. And I'm hoping that they're going to get stronger because they've got a couple more grades of climbs to go before the top grades are really, I'm too old to get the top grades. You watch these kids climbing and they're just amazing. I'm never going to get there, but I'm quite happy with what I'm doing at the moment.
That's cool. I had the climber Dave McLeod on an early episode of the podcast, and he went keto to drop a wee bit of weight. He was afraid he might drop a bit of strength, but actually went up a grade in his late 30s and his depression of 25 years lifted and hasn't come back. It was quite a cool story.
Yeah.
But basically, it's all about it's all about the ratio between the strength of the forearm and your weight, right? So if you can improve one or the other, then you're laughing.
Yeah, yeah. But I had a bad day on Saturday morning, but apart from that, it's been really good. But you can never tell. I've only been climbing for a year, so I'm still on the upward improvement curve. You can't tell how much is through going carnivore and how much is because I've been keto all the way through.
Yeah.
To say that I kind of envy these people that get the results from going keto, because keto is so easy socially.
Yeah.
It's just, somebody brings you a steak and chips. Okay, you eat the salad, you eat the steak, don't eat the chips. It's not the end of the world. But just eating the steak and leaving the whole plate crowded, that's slightly more of a problem. Yeah. But no, it's great because I was saying when I did Atkins induction, I was crippled for 2 weeks, couldn't go upstairs without getting tired leg muscles.
Wow.
And I was seriously compromised cycling for a lot of push biking those days for 6 to 8 weeks, something like that.
Yeah, my friend John found this exactly the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a fairly recent publication looking at elite level walking races, and they showed that going deep keto is bad for your performance, and they've done a massive amount of work on these elite walking races, and everything was stopped at the 3-week mark. And I just think what I was like when I was push biking, not at elite level, just push biking, at the 3-week mark, I was still being crucified. It was just, you're all right on the level, but the minute hill climb came up, then it was, oh, I'm tired. And that took me, I was in my 40s then, and that took me probably 6 months to get over completely, though I was fully functional by a month. But again, you look at, it comes back to looking at scientific papers, and you look at your own biases, and you look at the biases of the authors, and you just wonder why they chose 3 weeks to, because again, they cite all of the low carb athletic literature, and they talk about people needing 4 to 6 weeks to adapt, and then they terminate their study at 3 weeks. Come on, this, I'm biased. I'm not quite so obvious with my biases as that. Yeah.
Yeah, you've got an amazing thread of posts on the blog called Protons,
Yeah,
and right. I think if there's any scientists that come to me asking about where to start with all this, I say, well, if you want something really interesting beyond the sort of higher level stuff, you go to Protons and read from the start, because it takes us from the beginning of complex life a few billion years ago.
Yeah, because it parallels the life posts as well, because they're you can't separate the two really. It's Yes,
it takes you from all the way to the present day, and how our mitochondria, which I've spoken about a lot on the podcast, the little power plants within our cells, are fueled. I mean, how would you summarize what you learned from the Proton series of posts? And I should say that this question comes from Tucker Goodrich.
Oh. How would you summarize it? How would you summarize it? You gods. It's about 40 posts long.
I know, it's a bit of an unfair question.
Don't eat omega-6 fats if you can help it. Again, what level? That's a very murky question.
Yeah.
And probably go low carb. But that doesn't, it has over the years, it developed its own vocabulary, really. And it's quite difficult to talk about the Protons thread to people who've not worked at following it, because it says things that make grammatical sense, but unless you've actually had the layer after layer after layer put in place first, don't make any sense at all. It's kind of, and of course the whole thing ties into insulin as well, because the whole Protons concept is reactive oxygen species generation, And that's intrinsic to insulin signaling, and it's intrinsic to insulin resistance as well. So low levels of reactive oxygen species to get insulin to work, and high levels to stop it working. And the Protons tries to explain how those levels are generated. It all started really, well, the two things triggered it off. One thing was I'd realized that low carbing was good for me. I'd realized that high saturated fat appeared to be good for me. And I sat down and tried to work out what was different between the two processes, and started. And at that point, I had to work out exactly where the energy came from, because I was kind of working at that stage at the level of undergraduate BSc biochemistry, the stuff I was taught in the 70s at Royal Veterinary College, which was perfectly good biochemistry, and it's not really changed hugely since then. But I wasn't thinking, I was thinking that the glucose is oxidized to carbon dioxide and releases its water, and fat is oxidized to carbon dioxide and the hydrogen is oxidized to water. But I hadn't gone through the fine details. So I had to sit down, and we've been told all about these. NADH was a cofactor for this part of the Krebs cycle and this part, and it was a cofactor for glycolysis. And I hadn't really worked out where these energy molecules actually produce the energy from. And at that point, I had to start reading about NADH acting on being oxidized through complex 1. I had to find out what complex 1 was, what complex 2 was, because it's not the next one in the chain, what complex 3 was, complex 4 was. And I'm these are things that basically you go through a biochemistry course and you basically know them, but you don't think about them. And I'd had to make myself sit down and work out that actually you can do nothing with NADH without complex 1. And you've got this other input from complex 2. And actually, if you look at how fat metabolizes, it's all completely separate. And it produces acetylcholine, which is going to go through the same Krebs cycle as glucose does. But it's also got a big chunk of its energy coming from this stuff called electron transporting flavor protein, and that's going in at electron transporting flavor protein dehydrogenase. And nobody told me anything about that in biochemistry. They talked about beta oxidation, and it makes acetyl-CoA, and the acetyl-CoA goes into Krebs cycle. And I had to work out more or less from scratch what the different inputs were and how they might generate reactive oxygen species. And I worked out that the more input you had from the electron transporting flavor protein dehydrogenase, the more likely you were to generate reactive oxygen species. And I'd kind of got that far in the Protons ideas when Dave Spire emailed me and said, I've written a whole load of stuff on this, here's my paper. And he comes from a slightly different perspective. He comes from it from the origin of Lecker, which is last eukaryote common ancestor. And his feeling was that if you had too much FADH and per unit NADH, so you have a lot of input a little way down the electron transport chain, you would drive an awful lot of electrons the wrong way through complex 1, and you get far too many reactive oxygen species being produced, and that was damaging. And his whole interest was in the ratio of NADH to FADH, FDH2, same as mine was, but he'd gone on to look at it really, the cell, the eukaryote cell uses the peroxisome to protect itself from too much FADH. Am I getting beyond it? But basically he was looking at techniques evolutionary that the body used to avoid having too much reaction oxygen species being produced. Whereas I was a little bit further on, a little bit sideways from that, whereas I was looking at how you make the right amount of reactive oxygen species to do what you wanted to do. But the two things were basically looking at this ratio of where the energy comes from, rather than glucose versus fat. That glucose was predominantly NADH, and fat was much, much more biased towards FADH2. And that it was the ratio of those two. And when I heard from Dave Spire, I kind of realized that I might actually be barking up the right tree, because his bioessays paper, one of the early ones, was very, very convincing. I found that really well worth reading. So it went on from there. And there was a paper that was given by Stefan, is it Guinea?
Yeah.
Is that how it's pronounced?
That's how you say it, yeah.
Yeah. The paper was that insulin resistance is an antioxidant defense mechanism in cells. So the ability to resist insulin is how the cell protects itself from being given too many calories. And in that paper was the core concept that nanomoles of superoxide or hydrogen peroxide trigger insulin or are intrinsic to insulin signaling, and very large levels of superoxide or hydrogen peroxide are terminate insulin signaling when there is too much of it. Yeah, the rest of the Protons thread went on to try and work out how given metabolic substrates would fit into that protocol. Do they generate a little bit, or do they generate too much? And what's too little, what's too much, and how does that control the calorie input to the cell? So that really Protons is all about controlling calorie intake into an individual cell. And obviously lots and lots of cells, and they're all taking up calories. And as they get full, they start saying, okay, I've got enough calories, I'll become insulin resistant now, that'll just shut down. That's normal physiology, I don't need any more than this. While insulin is working, the calories going into cells, it's going into adipocytes, it's going into hepatocytes, and it's not particularly going into the brain. I'll come back to that in a second. And my next extension to Protons is that there should be circuits in the brainstem where reactive oxygen species are produced in the same way. I don't think the brain will ever do anything using the opposite technique of what's happening in the periphery. There will be a group of cells in the brain that mimic the rest of the body, and as initially the body will fill up. When the body is full, the calories will start to go into the cells in the brain, and the cells in the brain will go, oh, we don't need to eat anymore. And that's ultimately what will control appetite. There'll be all sorts of upper cerebral dopamine things as well, yes, but the core thing is, does the brain stem probably, or ventral hypothalamus, consider there are adequate calories around to stop you wanting to eat? And that will be taken from the same processes in the electron transport chain that determine whether calories are going to enter cells or not. Okay, which was a nice simple idea until I found about there's NADH, NADPH oxidase subgroup 4, which produce reactive oxygen species outside the mitochondria, just in the cytoplasm. And that to me was a major blow. It should all be the mitochondria that control calorie increase. But it turns out that again, there is crosstalk between NOx4 is what it's talked about. There's crosstalk between NX4 and the mitochondria. And you actually need both of them. But NOx4 is interesting because people think they can drug it quite easily to get rid of insulin resistance. I'm not sure why it won't work. But there are the two systems. It's quite nice actually, because as far as I can see, metformin works on the electron transport chain. It blocks one of the FAD2H2 enzymes, glycerol 3-phosphate dehydrogenase, but it won't block NOx4. So you can. I always wondered how if you blocked mitochondrial glycerol 3 dehydrogenase, how on earth you ever start an insulin signaling? Because I thought you had to have a functional electron, you had to have that input to the electron transport chain. Turns out you don't. You can start off with NOx4, which means you get less signaling, which is what metformin does. So you get all good. And and that'll be fine. I think I'm rambling a bit now, aren't I?
No, I mean, I wanted to let you expound on the Proton thread as much as you liked, because it's such a, I think, important point for people to get into the real nitty gritty of ultimately what makes a low carb, low linoleic acid diet so much more healthy than one that has more in it. And it's really, it really breaks it down. So I think for people who've never heard of that before and who've just listened to what you said, they're probably completely confused, but that's fine too, because they can check it out if they want to. But for other people, I think who've looked at it, it's really nice to sort of hear your thought process about how it progressed.
And again, it comes down to why omega-6 fatty acids are such a problem, because the normal physiology to resist extra calories coming into the cell are from reactive oxygen species being generated. And one of the main sources is electron transporting flavor protein dehydrogenase, the one that comes from fat. But the electron transporting flavor protein only gets reduced on the first step of beta oxidation, where the body physiology puts a double bond into your saturated fat, and in the process of putting the double bond in, takes away 2 hydrogens. The 2 hydrogens drop onto FADH to become FADH2, and they go off to generate reactive oxygen species. If you've already got the double bond there, there's no need to do that dehydration step or the dehydrogenation step. So there's no FADH generated if there's already a double bond there. So you can't make electron transporting flavor protein, or you can't reduce it. So you can't input from the double bond where you would input from a single bond in the saturated fat into the electron transport chain. And that messes up all of that won't generate reactive oxygen species. So you will end up, when the cell is accepting too many calories and insulin is signaling, the cell will keep on accepting the calories. And obviously, if there's a ton of ATP available, it's not going to get put down the electron transport chain, but it will go into storage. So the body will accept the calories and it will store them as triglyceride, which is why you get ectopic triglycerides all over the place. That was the inability to generate correct physiological insulin resistance keeps calories coming into a cell, and the omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids do that reliably. The one big bugbear I have is that omega-3 fatty acids should do the same thing, even worse. And you really have to tease the studies apart. And there's a kind of split. You can find indications that ALA, alpha-linoleic acid, is obesogenic, but you can find loads more that say it's not. And this is one of the things that I'm thinking about. I'm well aware that my hypothesis has got loads of bits that still need tidying up around it, but ALA should be more obesogenic. In the models where they've presented it almost accidentally as part of another intervention, it quite often does come out as being obesogenic, but when it's been used as a primary intervention, it's usually anti-obesogenic. And again, Tucker might have ideas as to hows and whys, because he's more interested in. I'm interested in signaling at the level of the electron transport chain. There are layers and layers and layers of signaling above that. Once you start breaking polyunsaturated fatty acid molecules and making 4-HNE, the ones Tucker will talk to you about already. Yeah. Then that's the next level up. And there are levels above that on cytokines and whatever else you want to talk about. But the bit that interests me is at the very, very basic level. And at the very, very basic level, ALA should be worse than linoleic acid. So
it's interesting.
So in every single study that's done, and it doesn't. So this is, again, I like things that really mess my ideas up, because I can go and look at them and try and work out, am I wrong? Or am I still in the right ballpark, but this is done differently for this reason? And on that one, I don't know.
That's interesting. Yeah, certainly the omega-6 sort of linoleic acid damage is myriad and on different levels, like you say. And, you know, from just a logical point of view, I think we are exquisitely adapted to the environment that we evolved in. That's why we're here, because our parents and their ancestors survived. But we you know, and we have a certain ability to deal with linoleic acid in the body, but above a certain threshold, not. You know, it might be that we had evolutionarily more exposure to omega-3 fatty acids that allows us to deal with them in a more constructive way.
Yeah, but I still want to get down to the nuts and bolts of the electron transport level, why we adapt and what we did makes it different. And again, of course, we talk glibly about omega-3 fatty acids, but really it's only ALA that's going to end up in the mitochondria. Yeah, the electron transport, if the carbon chain is longer than 18 long, it's going to end up in a peroxisome. The peroxisomes are where very long chain fatty acids are diverted. And by the time they come out the peroxisome, they're going to be C8, which is basically just caprylic acid. And that's, the mitochondria are quite happy with that. So, and again, you end up on the going a level up onto G protein coupled receptors that the very long chain fatty acids do all sorts of exciting things with. But again, that's the level that's above the level that I want to tease at. I tease at what happens at the very, very most basic level within the mitochondria. And all the stuff that happens up at cell surface level, it's all very exciting, very interesting, and undoubtedly is very important. But in terms of insight, I'm still back down stuck at this is what happens with reactive oxygen species generation if you do this, 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 and this. Yeah, high level stuff clearly matters, but I want it to fit in to a standard paradigm. The Protons thread has given a lot of explanatory power to a lot of apparently unrelated things, like how insulin signals and how insulin resistance happens. And I think it will turn out that insulin-induced insulin resistance, which I think is very, very important. We're talking about Jim Johnson, and so insulin-induced insulin will be a reactive oxygen species triggered phenomenon. Whether it's going to come from the mitochondria or from the NOx4 system, I wouldn't guess, but I guess it might be both, actually.
Be interesting to see how it all shakes out. Yeah, talking about your work as a veterinary surgeon, you know, I've seen a big upsurge in people feeding their dogs raw meat now, and getting onto a sort of species appropriate diet, if you like, for dogs. And it seems to be maybe happening a bit faster than people are realizing there's a species appropriate diet for humans. You know, can you talk about that at all?
It's grassroots led, basically. I think there's on a grassroots basis, then people are just doing it. There are a lot of problems within the profession of people doing it. There are referral centres that won't accept raw-fed dogs because they're excreting Campylobacter and Salmonella in their feces on a regular basis.
Right, yeah.
And there is serious concern on a human health basis that people are living with dogs that are excreting what are potential pathogens.
Wow.
However, I'm old, and I went through in microbiology back in the 70s. One of our lecturers drew at the front of the lecture theatre and said, right, if you go to Sainsbury's, you could use the Sainsbury's word. I'm sure it applies to all other supermarkets or all other butchers. And you buy a chicken and you bring it home. You're very careful how you handle it. You clean all the knives and everything afterwards. You roast it in the oven and you culture your feces. Next day, you'll be excreting Salmonella.
Wow.
You can culture your work surface at home, however much you've cleaned it. You'll culture salmonella. You can culture the uncooked chicken, obviously, if you like, and you'll culture salmonella, and you won't be ill. You'll be perfectly okay. And his question was, what is it about some people that will give them acute salmonellosis when you are going to Sainsbury's once a week, buying a chicken, roasting it for Sunday dinner, being grossly exposed to salmonella and having absolutely no problems at all? Okay, so I've worked on, I believe the guy. I don't see any reason why I should have been making it up. Obviously, it doesn't matter nowadays. It doesn't apply in the UK nowadays because all chickens are vaccinated against salmonella. But then we're coming through with Campylobacter. And again, I went to another CPD course on Campylobacter. And the guy was saying, yeah, we culture this feces and we find this dog with chronic diarrhea has got Campylobacter. But other times we'll culture dogs with perfect normal feces and they'll be positive for Campylobacter as well. And he said, actually, Campylobacter is probably commoner in normal dog feces than it is in chronic diarrhea dog feces. But these dogs are still normal dogs, normally fed, excreting Campylobacter, are still going into referral centres for orthopaedic surgery. I don't know whether people simply have they've not been through. I remember these things is my problem. I remember that a human household cooking a chicken, everyone in the household will excrete salmonella for 24 hours without getting ill. And I remember that if you really want to get a positive Campylobacter sample, take it from a healthy dog. It's more common in them than it is in diarrhea. And I was thinking, well, we're told these things, and the people that are telling us have no axe to grind about anything. Nobody even thought about raw feeding back in the 1970s. Well, apart from Tom Lonsdale, but so there were people, but this was not an issue. Whereas nowadays it is an issue, and I think I don't really know what you make of it. As far as I can tell, the dogs do perfectly well on it, and to get clinical salmonellosis from a dog or a cat that's fed raw meat, I think if it happens, you are on an absolute godsend publication straight away, because if you can find something down on raw feeding, it gets published like that. There have been some hiccups with raw feeding, but when you think of how many hiccups there have been with commercial feeding, I have lists in my head of disasters that we've had through commercial feeding over the years. They go on and on and on and on. There's about one every 3 years. Again, back in the early 80s, we had Key-Gaskell syndrome, which was never proven to be nutritional, but I'm damn sure it was. It was a failure of the autonomic nervous system, the parasympathetic autonomic nervous system.
Sounds terrible.
These cats presented with dry mouth, dilated, fixed dilated pupils, complete gastric stasis, complete intestinal stasis, tachycardia, fast heart rate, and it was intractable, utterly intractable. If you eventually started stomach tubing them or put in a feeding tube to get calories into them, they just projectile vomited it out. We put them on anticholinesterase, and the death rate was horrendous. They mostly died, and it just disappeared. And my suspicions. There was a place in the States that found they could use chicken offal and put it in a can and sell it as cat food. And the chicken offal was very, very high in phosphate. And there was a cluster of hyperphosphatemic renal failure cases surrounding this factory. There was another case where somebody found you could stick salmon in a can and sell it as cat food, and the cats all got coagulation problems from the massive amounts of omega-3 fatty acids that they were getting.
Wow.
We all know about, well, there's a current one on the go with, I think Tom Norton blogged about it, with taurine deficiency in dogs, which never been heard of before, but it's a feature of these modern paleo diets, dogs, where they don't want to make them all meat because you can't really sell that in dry food. It doesn't work, so they're solidifying them with pea protein and similar legumes, which is not quite paleo, but there are associated with one or two of these diets, taurine deficiency, cardiomyopathy. And I'd say Tom's quite dismissive of it in his blog post, But to me, the ones that actually end up seeing a cardiologist in dilated heart failure are the tip of the icebergs. It's a bit like, statins produce diabetes in 2% of people per year, but they don't. 2% of people cross the threshold from not being diabetic to being diabetic based on an arbitrary number. Everybody has impaired glucose tolerance if they're going to mess up the coenzyme Q levels in the electron transport chain. So I can see exactly why people want to raw feed. I can see exactly why the food industry is going to fight tooth and nail against it. Back when I was a clinician, because I'm not really a clinician anymore, I don't deal with, I'm nearly retired. I go in, I do a theatre list Thursday morning, Friday morning, I walk out. So I don't talk to clients terribly much. I'm mostly doing routine surgery. But when I did, I had a standard hypoallergenic diet that I used for particularly managing chronic gut problems. And I just used to put them on mince. If people wanted to cook the mince, they just told us to boil it for 120 seconds. That would kill the salmonella. They put on mince, they put on a bone meal supplement, and they were given liver once a week. That was it. That was the exclusion diet. And I left a number of these dogs in Berkshire when I left, and the Berkshire practice kept up with me for years afterwards, but all the time we were up in Glasgow and back into Norfolk. And I get these emails saying, this dog, it's a German Shepherd dog. It's 14 years old. It's been on meat and bone meal for 7-8 years. What should we do with it? I said, well, carry on. I don't know, there was n equals 5 or 6, something like that. But generally the effects, particularly listening to people on the internet in the raw feeding groups, the effects are very similar to putting people on a carnivore diet. It's not a placebo, a panacea. It doesn't sort everything out, but for a number of dogs, they do extremely well on it. Yeah.
And have you ever seen it backfire?
Maybe. No, I mean, in terms of have I had a client come and complain to me, no. Again, as a clinician, I've always been very careful. I'm not very good at telling people you must do this. I will tell people that I will feed my animals. If you wish to go there, and on that basis, this has happened, this has happened, and this has happened. On that basis, if you wish to go and Google, I'll send it to Tom Lonsdale's website. He's the original Raw Meaty Bones vet. And on your head be it. I had a standard spiel that, okay, if you feed Raw Meaty Bones, you'll have, if you feed Raw Meaty Bones, you will occasionally run into this problem, this problem, this problem. The first is they're going to break teeth. Every now and again, one of my cats broke one of its teeth on a chicken wing. And it has real trouble eating chicken wings now that it's got one missing carnassial at the top here. They'll occasionally get bone impactions. And if you get a bone impaction in the rectum, some poor out of hours vet on a Sunday afternoon is going to have to spend 2 hours digging up concrete poo out of the back of your dog, and neither you nor I is going to be popular when it finally comes back to and occasionally get bone stuck in their esophagus. It's very rarely a problem with whole carcass feeding, but if you ever have it happen, then that is a life-threatening, extremely expensive emergency to get sorted out. So those are the problems, and you don't tell people just do this, this will be fine. You say you have a decision to make. This is the problem, this is the problem, this is the problem. If you don't risk those problems and you stay with where you are now, well, the problems are here and they're endless. But there is no free lunch. There is no, this is problem free, it sorts everything out. On balance, I'm much more in favor of raw feeding, but it has to be the right client. It has to be the right mindset. And people have to be aware that nothing is problem free ever. Yeah,
that makes sense. I'd heard about another one. There's a guy called Dogtor with a G. Dogtor.
I read some of this stuff a long time ago. Yeah.
he talks about how you don't see many Irish setters now because, on the whole, dry dog food went from corn-based to wheat-based sometime in the 80s or 90s, and that they have a particular susceptibility to wheat.
My wife was studied. The Ed Hall is a different Hall. Ed Hall was internal medicine at Bristol, and he was instrumental in determining that Irish setters had full-blown, genetically confirmable celiac disease. The only species breed that it's been done for, but they are the poster dog for celiac disease. And my wife, in fact, played Ed Hall in the final year review. He had metabolic syndrome. I don't know whether he still has, but she had to have a cushion under a big white shirt so that she had a big sticky out tummy. But he was a really nice chap. He still is a really nice chap, I hope. But no, he worked out the genetics for Irish setters. Virtually all of the other, and that's single gene, and the minutest amount of gluten in the diet will trigger horrendous gut rot with them, and it's real. And people will go from marketed absolute hypoallergenic diets in a bag through to, well, this one we got from the internet for half the price, and it's got the same ingredients in it, but it's going to have trace gluten in it, and the dogs will just, gut function just falls to pieces. I had that happen with Irish setters, and clients who were a little bit short of a penny had to go and find a cheaper alternative. And they weren't the sort of clients that you could have talked to raw feeding about, and that was in the days before I would have been talking about it anyway. I don't know, seen Atkins setters. Ed Hall from Bristol University Vet School was the original guy, and taught my wife. I'm far too old. I probably qualified before he did. Teach me. Anyway, celiac disease, but I think loads and loads of other dogs either have gluten intolerance or starch intolerance in the same way as people with IBS, if they carry the right genetic markers, really won't get on with starch at all. And those are people usually with northern latitude genetics. So that's HLA-B27. Have you heard of that one?
No.
HLAs are human leukocyte antigens. They're cell surface markers on your white blood cells. And if you carry the B27 marker, the B27 marker was the first ever human white blood cell subtype to be tied to a specific disease.
Right.
It was back in the 60s, I think, just before I went to uni. The geneticists taught us that basically HLA-B27 in people, ankylosing spondylitis, it's the only complete tie together in an autoimmune disease that we've got. And that was Prof. Ebering at King's College, London, was an immunologist that picked that one up. So if your white blood cells carry the HLA-B27 marker, they can pick up a certain protein and regard it as foreign. Yeah, and the protein that the B27 marker happens to pick up is on an enzyme which the Klebsiella bacterium in your gut uses to break down starch. It's a debranching enzyme. It takes the side branches off of the long starch chains. It's called pullulinase. It's used in making polyols, the polyol sugars.
Sure.
But in the bacterium uses it for debranching the side chains of starch molecules. And if your immune system sees the pullulinase enzyme, it recognizes a little triplet of amino acids as foreign, and it makes antibodies against them. Presumably, particularly if you're also eating something that causes your intestine to be permeable like gluten. But pullulinase is what triggers the immune response. And when the antibody is made to pullulinase, it happens to drop onto one of the collagen subtypes in your spine that's got a similar peptide in the collagen. So the antibody then labels your spine as being foreign, and your immune system looks at your spine as being foreign and attacks it. And this is where ankylosing spondylitis comes from. And Ebringer, that was the first ever tie together between B27 on human leukocytes and an autoimmune disease, which is ankylosing spondylitis. Apparently, it also triggers IBS, so IBS, ankylosing spondylitis, and some of the people with things like Crohn's and things like that are HLA-B27 positive as well. But it was very interesting because he'd actually got the molecular mechanism for how it worked and why it was selective for collagen type 9 or something. There was a collagen type in your thing. He also so some people are starch intolerant. So,
yeah, I think I am. You know, I get what I've always, because I've got a string of autoimmune problems behind me, and I found that starch causes, if not heartburn, then pain from the mouth through to the stomach, in a way that feels more like a sort of if not allergy, then an immune attack or something going on. And starch doesn't agree with me at all. I've tried it a few times on and off, and just doesn't work. And it's actually, sugar's better than starch.
Yeah. Obviously, if it is, this is why I wonder whether I might get on with coffee once I change my gut bacteria. Didn't work. Okay, but yes, starch is one of the big bugbear ones, and the further north you come from, the more likely you are to be B27 positive. It's not only B27, there are other HLA markers that will do the same thing.
Do they show up on 23andMe, do you know?
I have no idea.
Because I've had that done. I might go hunting again for that group.
I don't think it would, but have a look. He's also got there's a nitrogenase that I think it's Proteus uses to break down urea to extract the energy from it. And that has a similar peptide, but the antibody that's made to that peptide reacts with your fingers, the collagen in your fingers. So that's looking at rheumatoid arthritis. Again, he's got protocols, starch avoidance for ankylosing spondylitis. It works perfectly well. And he's got various protocols, those things he puts in place to try and avoid the urinary excretion. He goes a low protein diet, urinary excretion of nitrogenous waste as much as you can help, to try and minimize the Proteus, which is where the trigger factor comes for rheumatoid disease, rheumatoid arthritis. And it's not quite as good a story. I think you have Proteus in your gut as well as in your urinary tract. And I think when you go paleo, you sort that out. So he's got a whole load of these. He's got one for MS as well. There's a protein produced by Acinetobacter. And again, going low carb is going to get rid of your Acinetobacters as well. So he's a very interesting guy. And again, I met him socially once. And I know people, friends. He was a big buddy of John Yudkin. They were
right.
Same. He picked up the original. His original interest in food and ankylosing spondylitis was that he got a guy coming in for spinal stabilization surgery for his ankylosing spondylitis, and they fasted him overnight before he came in, because that's what they used to do. And he came in the morning and said, "My back's better." The normal response from a medic to that is, "Okay, bye, next please." And Ebringer went, "Oh, that's interesting." That's it. So
the guy hadn't had his potatoes with his dinner and he was fine.
Yeah, and he hadn't had toast for breakfast.
Yeah.
That was when Ebringer had arthritis patients who needed to lose weight. He started telling them to follow Yudkin's advice and go low carb, and the people going, "I've lost weight, but my arthritis has gone away." I kind of looked at this and went, "That's interesting," and followed it on. And people got their PhDs from it, and he found HLA-B27. That was the first one he found. No, interesting chat that was. He's an interesting guy.
I guess there's only one question I've got left, and this one came from Tucker as well, although it was something that I was, something similar I was going to ask, is that if you had kind of one recommendation for people who are on the standard American diet, to just change one thing, what would it be?
Oh God, I saw that come through somebody put it up as a Twitter choice. Did you get rid of seed oils, sugar, or something else? I can't remember what the other
Refined flour, maybe.
Something like that, yeah. I think that's unanswerable. It's unanswerable. I think we had problems. Again, you see, Tucker is the person that's looked at this more than anybody else, because I looked at this originally as a kind of just as a thought, and I thought, well, people didn't ship margarine up to the Eskimo Inuit in the 1800s. They shipped sugar and they shipped flour because they're very valuable commodities. So I'd have put sugar and flour on a par with each other. But then Tucker's got omega-6s going in from a very early stage.
Adulterated lard and that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. And again, does that happen in the UK? This is the question. I mean, we don't have cotton oil in the UK. Did we ever adulterate our lard with cotton oil to maximize lard sales in the early 1900s? I don't think that's answerable. It's a question. So and to be quite honest, that brings up another question, and that is that if the problem at the electron transport chain from omega-6 fats is that they do not generate enough insulin resistance to stop you getting obese, does it matter if the insulin levels are rock bottom? So if you're on a ketogenic diet, would omega-6 fats still make you obese? And the Inuit would have been on a very high omega-6 diet because there's plenty of it in marine products. So they should have become obese, but they never did because they were chronically hypoinsulinemic. That would be my explanation for why that happens. And again, that feeds into whether people on ketogenic diets are going to do well or badly on omega-6 fat-based diets. And if you're actively losing weight and you don't have other problems, then you probably get away with it. And there are little markers that they might give faster weight loss than saturated fat diets at the cost of you replacing all of your adipose tissue with omega-6 fatty acids, which, and you obviously on a ketogenic diet, you have very rapid fatty acid turnover in your adipocytes. So you're probably putting an awful lot of omega-6 fats in there, which may not be good for you down the road, but they might actually work perfectly well for weight loss if you're calorically restricted, which you're going to be if you drop your insulin levels through the floor. So, because you automatically restrict your own calories because you're not hungry. So it gets, again, I've been thinking about these things a lot. And you look at the control, trying to find what controls the input of, or the throughput of electrons down the electron transport chain, what regulates that when you're on a ketogenic diet. Your free fatty acids are 2000 micromoles per liter, and there's potentially infinite supply of ATP generation. It's regulated, and it's regulated because the fatty acids inhibit electron transport down the electron transport chain. Where they inhibit, how they inhibit it is a different matter altogether, and I think the research on that has either been done sideways, accidentally, looking at different problems, or simply hasn't been done. And it's very patchy, and I can't work out exactly where either the fatty acyl CoA or the fatty acyl carnitine moiety fits onto the electron transport chain. It's probably going to be somewhere around complex 3, but I can't pin it down, and people aren't doing the studies because these are very complicated things to look at. But there is a regulation, and basically there's more ATP produced, or there's more maximal flow available for electrons down the electron transport chain if you're based on omega-6 fats. But I see so many problems long term with them. So I don't think it's possible to pull it out. If you're on the SAD, Standard American Diet, without, it's just all so bad. I can't pull out which one would be the worst.
That's fair enough. I think in answering it, you've answered so much.
Yeah. So
well, I reckon I could talk with you for another couple of hours on all this. Of there's other things that I would want to talk about, but maybe you can come on again sometime in the future. I I really appreciate you taking the time, and thanks again. And last thing, I guess, is beyond the Hyperlipid blog, which is high fat. What's it called again? High fat nutrition.blogspot or something.
Oh, I don't know. I've always called it Hyperlipid. I don't know what it comes up on a search engine.
I'll put it in the show notes anyway. But beyond that, is there anywhere else that you want people to find you?
Hyperlipid's really the only place. I have got a Twitter account. I look at Twitter occasionally. I don't post anything, and people keep asking to be friends on Facebook as well.
Right.
Facebook basically is where I put pictures of my cats, or a decent wave when it's on the beach and I was wishing I was in a kayak and getting out there on it. I don't really post anything nutritional there at all. And I have an acquaintance who was a vet student, came through the practice with us, who's a very, very major vegan now, and I just occasionally comment on her, don't forget to keep taking the B12 supplements. Nice girl, I wouldn't want to end up with demyelination problems.
Okay.
No, Hyperlipid's really, I think, my only presence on the internet, and it just represents ideas that won't let me go. They won't. I don't have any choice about this at all. This is not something I planned ever to do, and the whole blog is now so big that if there's something I know I've blogged about, and I look back and I can't find it, and there's too much on there. But that's just what's happened over the last 15 years or so. Okay.
Yeah, well, it's a brilliant resource, and I think it's amazing what you've done, and I really appreciate your work and taking the time today as well.
You're very welcome, Ali. It's been nice talking to you. That's great.
Thanks, Peter.